But I really want to be able to do this face to face because I really appreciate the idea of an EcoRotary club. I was telling Jake earlier, my father was an avid Rotarian for many, many years, and really admired what he did. I just never gotten involved in Kona myself, but the idea of an EcoRotary club, it's just, that's wonderful. Really appreciate that. And when I heard about it, I was really excited to be able to share with you what we're planning to do here. And that introduction, thank you, Jake, for the introduction. I will touch on some of that here in a minute, but I think the key there, I'm trained as a marine biologist, and I felt really called, or almost pushed. It was like a firm hand in the middle of my back, pushing me to say, if you really want to do something useful, you've got to get involved in aquaculture. And that was very early in my career. So the reason why we're here is we have a proposal that we've been moving forward with community consultation and outreach to federal and state agencies for a fish and limu operation that would be out offshore of Ewa Beach, where previously there had been, those of you who've been here for a while may remember the Moi farm that was out there that operated for a number of years. You don't need my contact information, you've already got my card. But so Oceaneer, I'm the co-founder of the company, and we've worked both in the pearl farm development work and now in the fish farm development work. This is really what drives us here. We like to think we want to be able to use profit incentives to be able to affect the changes that we want to see, the environmental benefits that we want to see. And you know, we can distill perhaps there's more than 6, but sort of the most looming, in terms of from a marine biology perspective, the most looming issues here is perhaps these 6 here. And when I think about this, and when we as a company think about this, ways that we could start to benefit this is just, well, grow more seaweed, more macroalgae that absorbs nutrients, requires no land area, no fresh water, and it absorbs CO2 as well. And then also grow more fish. There's been a number of studies, I'll touch on some of them in more detail later, but that have identified the fact that if we're going to move towards a less impactful diet, that rather than terrestrial animal protein, beef or pork or chicken, that seafood is a lot less impactful from a global perspective. So this is what we want to be doing. For some reason now it doesn't click through for me, Jake. Sorry. There we go. I'll use the pad then, will I?
No, I just had to.
Okay. Okay. So we all of us, you look at the global issues out there, and I think of this both people and planet, but from the people's perspective, there are going to be more people, 10 billion, we all know, they're going to be more affluent. And when people become more affluent, they want to eat more animal protein. And often that is, they want to be eating more sushi, but they're also being told by their doctor they should be eating more seafood and less beef. So all of this is driving, the projections are there's going to be more demand for more seafood. And in terms of the health benefits, you all should be eating more seafood as well. I like to quote this study from 2006, which was looking at the risks and benefits. Back in the early 2000s, there'd been a lot of hand-wringing about mercury and PCBs in seafood, particularly in farmed fish. It was being used to smear farmed fish as a reason to scare people away from it. But dear old Darius Mozaffarian and his colleagues went and did a meta-analysis looked at all of the studies that had looked at the risks and the benefits, the risks from mercury and PCBs and the benefits from the heart-healthy omega-3s that are in seafood. And their conclusion from looking at all of these studies was that Americans should be doubling their seafood consumption, eating twice as much oily fish as they do. And if they would do this, that there would be a 36% reduction in deaths from heart disease, and a 17% reduction in mortality. 17% reduction. That's, as I like to say, that's up there with seatbelts and smoking in terms of a public health imperative. So where are we going to get all of this extra seafood from then in terms of the planetary impact? It just can't come from catching more fish. There are limited resources out there. And this is started out as a fisheries biologist. I was managing wild stock fisheries in my first work in the Cook Islands, working for the government down there. But there's been an increasing sense of there aren't plenty more fish in the sea. This was a definitive study in 2004 that said 90% of the big fish are already gone from the oceans. We took them. They didn't just disappear. We took them. There was this study here in 2006 by Boris Worm and colleagues that had tracked the collapse of fish stocks around the planet. By collapse, they meant down to less than 10% of its original biomass. And the projection was, which was widely publicized in the media, was that the fish are going to be gone by 2048. They're not going to be gone, but they'll all have collapsed. They'll all be less than 10% of their original biomass by 2048. That was, there was a lot of lively debate around that, and Boris Worm and some other folk actually then collaborated and said, well, no, it's not going to be really that bad, because there are some pockets like the US and New Zealand and Australia, and perhaps sometimes in the EU, where fisheries are being better managed, but still the overall trends are pretty grim. The North Atlantic cod, which was, the early assessments of this was that the marine biologist said there's no way that you could possibly overfish this stock. But, you know, you buy enough boats and you put enough trawl gear on them, and you go at it hard enough, you put a dollar value on a common property resource, and you don't manage it well enough. And this is what happens, is that inevitably you'll get this collapse. And that collapse happened in 1992. Do the math. It's over 30 years ago. Those stocks have not come back. When you go and you take a fish out, a stock out to that level, you end up with these massive ecosystem disruptions. And we can see it here when we've taken a whole stock out, but when we're taking large proportions of a stock out, the similar sorts of disruptions happen. And so everybody's surprised when, like, last year, Alaskan crab stocks disappeared. They were gone. And everyone's like, well, where'd they go? Oh, let's blame global warming. Right, yeah, blame global warming. For these shifts, you can't just keep going and taking pieces hand over fist and expecting the stocks to remain. And this is particularly so as you get closer down to the base of the food chain, to the smaller fish. This is anchovies and sardines and pilchards. And this is just the typical boom and bust collapse you see in wild stock fisheries. Even with all of the sophisticated science in there around predicting what the allowable catch would be, the one thing that the US has done, and New Zealand, Australia, and to some extent the EU has done, is called individual quotas, where essentially you privatize the fishery. You say, okay, this fishery can only handle 30 licenses. We're going to actually only issue 25 licenses. The rest of you are out of work. Go and find some other employment. And you 25 licenses, we're going to limit the catch of the number of fish that you can take each year. That works, but it really limits in the amount of fish that we can get to provide for folk. Really want to drive this point home. I'm sorry, I get worked up about this stuff. But this is perhaps the most instructive visual that I have seen that really drives home what we have done to the oceans out there. This is the biomass of table fish that folk would eat in the North Atlantic back in 1900, where red is over 11 tons per kilometre squared. So red is lots of fish, and pale blue is pretty much nothing. And that's in 1900, and then in 1999. They're gone. I mean, let's go back and look at that again. I mean, it's scary. Yes, everybody looks horrified. It's really scary. 100 years and they're gone. We get really good at just driving fish stocks to what they call economic extinction. We don't often drive them to complete extinction, but economic extinction they don't bounce back from that.
Statistical error on those maps.
What is a statistical error? I can provide you with the reference there, Christensen and co, but I don't know that error around there. Happy to provide that link for you there.
Here it is.
So there's this need that then just anybody looks at this and says, we need more fish. It can't come from just fishing harder. And even the environmental NGOs, a lot of whom back when we were first starting offshore aquaculture, and I'd made this shift from pearl farming early in my career, we were doing all these pearl oyster hatchery developments. We're using pearl oyster hatcheries because the pearl oyster stocks had all been overfished. We're starting pearl farms, and everybody loved a pearl farm. I mean, no problem with that. I mean, oysters, filter feeders, and really high value in these really remote lagoons. But I felt, again, the firm hand in the middle of my back of fate pushing me towards, there's a global food crisis out there. You can't just sit here and play with these trinkets and baubles. You've got to go and do something that actually feeds people. And when I started to get involved in fish farming, initially, the fish farmers that you'd meet at aquaculture conferences, they'd look really beaten down and just bitter and depressed. And you start to get more involved and you start to understand why. Is that everybody hates fish farmers. It's just the reputation for farmed fish is such that, and the NGOs at the time, Conservation International, Environmental Defence Fund, Ocean Conservancy, were all very strongly opposed to the idea of farming fish in the ocean because they just thought it couldn't be done properly. Monterey Bay Aquarium, every farmed fish in the ocean was ranked red until actually we got our farm in Kona to be ranked as a good alternative. We were the first marine fish farm that Monterey Bay Aquarium ranked separately. But so there was this whole drumbeat of marine aquaculture is bad. And now there's been this pivot. Blessedly, those NGO folks who are driven by science are now a lot more embracing of aquaculture. Part of this was driven by this work by Conservation International in 2012, I believe it was, the Blue Frontiers study that they'd gone and done a life cycle assessment of all the different forms of animal protein and came to the conclusion, and this was novel at the time, like, holy hell, we can't, if people are eating beef, and if the rest of the world starts to eat beef at the way that Americans are eating beef, then the planet is screwed. There's not enough fresh water, there's not enough land area, and the methane production is going to, doesn't matter what we're trying to do for other global warming issues. So Conservation International came out with, it's 2011, sorry, came out with this Blue Frontier study and were widely disparaged from the rest of the ENGO community. But over time, the science has become increasingly compelling. So that here at the United Nations, a high-level panel on global climate change in the oceans, and this is with some real luminaries in here, Overhoff Goldberg and Steve Gaines from Bren. One of their five major conclusions was humanity needs, from a climate change perspective, humanity needs to eat more marine sourced foods. The Nature Conservancy is now very pro aquaculture, both what they call restorative aquaculture, which is limu, seaweed, and bivalves, but then they also recognize that we need to have fish culture. And so you can see they're showing here offshore culture or nearshore net pen culture. That's something that they would support. And then WWF, the Panda Bear folk, they had been involved in the development of the aquaculture dialogues starting in 2000. That again was a recognition of, okay, we're going to have aquaculture. Let's just try and have the right sorts of aquaculture, and let's try and encourage better aquaculture. And so that led to the formation of the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. Not very well known inside the US, but very well known in Europe. It's sort of the aquaculture equivalent of the Marine Stewardship Council, which is certification of sustainable stocks, wild stocks. ASC is certification of environmentally and socially responsible aquaculture. full disclosure, I sit on ASC's technical advisory group. I'm a big fan of all that they do. But the point here is that came from an initiative that had been led by WWF. And just recently here in the US, there's been the formation of the Coalition for Sustainable Aquaculture, which is a whole group of NGOs and companies and investor funds, and Ocean Era has joined as well. CSA was set up by Environmental Defence Fund, that they have now come to where they're actively pushing for legislation that will allow for offshore aquaculture in US waters. They're wanting to see a very slow growth trajectory, so there's a very interesting conversation that happens in there about what that growth might look like, but I think they're coming to understand that we need to be moving more quickly on this. So it's a global imperative, and it's been more widely recognized as such. So then what are we doing with that then? Well, like I say, the two things that we want to do as a company is we feel personally and professionally compelled to do it is grow more seaweed and to grow more fish. So in Kona at the Natural Energy Lab, which is when you come to for your beach cleanup on Kona side or Hilo side?
That's on Hilo side.
Enjoy the rain. But next time, perhaps we don't get as much detritus washed up on our beaches on the leeward side. So I guess that's obvious. But next time you come to Kona, come and have a drive through the Natural Energy Lab. It's a phenomenal facility in terms of aquaculture innovation. There's a little bit of energy research happens there. Most of it now, 70% of the revenues there now are from aquaculture. And I've been there for the 34 years that I've been here in Hawaii. I've been working there at the it's like I feel like a kid in a candy store there. Our company has been based there because we want to be able to do the research there and then be able to take it out and scale it in the ocean, because we think that's the least impactful way to do it. A lot of the work we're doing now is in terms of figuring out how to grow more limu is tank-based, because we've got to, there's a huge dearth of knowledge here around how we might be growing limu in the tropics, just things like the sargassum, figuring out how to sporulate it, how to spawn it so you can get keikis attached onto the strings. And the same also for the ulva, the sea lettuce there. And then looking at the growth rates, because growth rate's going to drive the economics and the feasibility of that. A species such as the gracilaria, we get phenomenal growth rates on that. That's a non-native gracilaria. So we're not going to be growing that in the oceans offshore, but still it's instructive. And again, the beauty of limu for those of us that are coming at this with both an environmental and an economic perspective, need no land area, no fresh water, and no artificial fertilizer. And you can grow it then in the ocean. So when we're thinking about commercial opportunities, we want to be able to have market drivers, as I'd said, economic and environmental drivers behind this. And so when we think about what you might be doing with that limu, food or feed or fertilizer or biofuels, a lot of our work is funded by a lot of our seaweed work is funded by the Department of Energy, because they see it as a great potential biofuel. And then also carbon footprint, because we like the alliteration. There's a lot of people are excited about the potential to use seaweed to capture carbon out of the surface waters and then put it to the bottom of the ocean. We think there are probably better uses of that seaweed rather than just sinking it. And we're focusing on the higher value areas of food and feed. Our real standout here is the sea grapes, and I'm sorry, I'm remiss. I should have brought some. Whenever I hit this slide, I think I should have had a bowl of sea grapes in the middle here. Coming soon to a restaurant or a retail outlet near you. We are selling in Kona here. We've had folk describe this as seaweed champagne. But all of this is the work to date, the research, and when we're thinking about scaling up the sea grapes at the moment, it's all focused on land-based, and that's really expensive. And so that's, you know, our sea grapes, it's retailing for like $35 a pound. Then you end up in sushi restaurants. You're not where we want to be, is for people to be sitting down to a bowl of seaweed salad. there. That's going to really start to drive consumption and help us get to scale and get the price down. That's really ideally would be out offshore. So that's the seaweed R&D work that we're doing. And then in terms of growing more fish, there are sort of three things that we as a company think that we need to be doing, need to be focusing on. One is just developing more sustainable feeds for the carnivorous fish, like the kampachi or the snappers or the groupers, the fish that eat other fish or crabs. But then also, there's been a lot, we've spent a lot of the last 20 years developing those diets. So essentially turning the carnivores into vegetarians, which we've been able to do by essentially feeding them tofu, which is, humans can survive on a vegetarian diet. Fish can as well, so long as you balance the amino acids and the fatty acids in the right ratios there. But then also it makes a lot of sense, and it's always puzzled me why there hasn't been more work on herbivorous fish that actually eat at the base of the food chain in the waters here. And globally, there's been very little research on that. I mean, for the tropics, there's milkfish and there are mullet that are herbivorous fish that, sorry, in tropical marine waters, there's milkfish and mullet. In subtropical, colder water, marine waters, there's none at all. But we think about fish like the nue, which is a local species here. It's throughout the warm waters of the world. It's very highly favored here. And it essentially makes a living turning seaweed into sashimi. And then also, the other thing that's really important, if we're going to develop all of this technology, we need to be able to figure out how to farm them. And so we want to be able to be pioneering farms here in Hawaii waters, because if we're not willing to do it here, we shouldn't be taking it somewhere else and exporting whatever footprint that represents to other places. We should find ways that we can be doing this locally here. I may run on long at some stage. If you need to hurry things along, Jake, let me know, please. So the Nanue, we're big fans of this. This is for perhaps the last 10 years. We've been doing research work on trying to figure out how to grow them in the hatchery and then what to feed them. And if you just feed this fish, it's an herbivore, so you can feed it the same sort of feed that you would give to tilapia. And this here shows you what they will do on a tilapia diet. They'll reach a harvestable size inside of it, 1.5 pounds inside of a year. And they can actually do that on a diet of duckweed. Duckweed is a noxious, invasive freshwater weed that people are trying to get rid of. And this fish, you dry it and you put into a diet. It's very high protein. This fish thrives on that. And then there's also tremendous market appeal here. We had maybe 60 fish that were research subjects from our work in Kona, and we took them into KTA, and I took them in there about middle of the morning, and I told the guy at the seafood counter, I said, okay, so this is on a Friday morning. I said, I'll give you a call on Monday or Tuesday and see how they're going. And he said, they're going to be gone by tomorrow morning. And one of my team went in there late in the afternoon and took a photo of an empty shelf, which isn't very instructive unless you tell the story. But we love looking at that empty shelf there. This is a fish that Hawaii loves here. So I want to give a bit more, that's sort of the big perspective of what we want to do. This is sort of nailing down into pioneering this work here in Hawaii. And I want to talk about that work that we've done. As I said, we'd started the offshore fish farm down there, just straight off the airport. Here you can see on this photo over here, this is the airport in Kona. That's the Natural Energy Lab with all the asters and the spirulina ponds. And so this is just about a half a mile out offshore. And this operation has been there now for 19 years. There's the manta ray diving in Kona, which you've all done the manta ray dives in Kona, right? Yeah. That happens, well, this is one of the two sites, just right in the middle of this bay here. So there's 15, 20 boats out there on most nights. And so there's a lot of diver presence there. If there had been any impact on that reef over the last 20 years, people would have been kicking and screaming. And there's been none. And the science, the monitoring that DAR has done has also confirmed that. So we're really that's great validation that you can do this. So long as you're in deep enough water, far enough offshore, you can do this in a way that has no significant environmental impact and often no measurable impact. Here, when we're doing the water quality monitoring between up current and down current of those fish pens, you can't really tell that the fish pens are there because there's out offshore, there's so much water that moves through there. So we ran this from 2004 through to 2009. Remember 2009, global financial crisis? So do our investors. And they were like, we're done. We were able to, over that period of time, we built it up to where we had 8 of these sea stations. This is a submersible pen that goes down about 30 feet below the surface of the water. Just for some sense of scale, that's me there on the left-hand side. So these are 80 feet or so in diameter. Our best year there, we grew about 500 tons in 2008. Since 2009, it's been operated by another company that had come in. The company that actually made the net pens came in and took it over. Their plans now are to build out to 2,500 tons. They're about 800 or 900 tons a year now. But they're planning on expanding about a threefold on that. We'd also, back in 2009, we'd had to sell that operation. And then 2011, we started what we called the Villela Project. And this was the main driver behind this was to force the federal government to give us a permit to grow fish in federal waters from 3 miles out to 200 miles out offshore. There'd only been one instance previously of wherever there'd been an aquaculture attempt at farming fish in federal waters, and that was down in the Gulf of Mexico. And the federal government had a permitting pathway, but nobody was dumb enough to really try it until we came along. With support from the National Science Foundation. Thank you very much. So our idea was to just have an unanchored pen, both because we wanted to test out that concept to see if it had potential commercial viability, but also it's pretty clear you're going to have no impact on that if it's just drifting around in 6,000 to 12,000 feet deep water, you're not going to have any impact there. It still took us 2 years to get the permits to do that. There was a really rigorous federal permitting process. And then when we came back again to do a second iteration, mooring it in 6,000 feet deep water on a 2 mile wide watch circle that it had, that again took us another 2 years to get the permits for that. So it's not like there's no.
Just backing up a second, when you say no impact on that, what impact are you referring to?
Impact on water quality or on the seabed or on marine mammals or fish stocks.
This is from like the fish waste that's accumulating.
Yeah. Either through the urine, the nitrogen that's dissolved, or the particulates. I mean, if you're going to be out in 6,000 feet deep water with the sort of currents that we have offshore here, this was 6 miles offshore. We wanted to be in federal waters because we wanted to keep pushing the federal government to permit this. And this was also, we wanted to also just raise awareness about aquaculture. And so we're quite happy to take, Bob Ballard came out on this, and we took a bunch of journalists out there as well. And Time magazine recognized this as one of the best inventions of 2012. It wasn't actually our invention. We were just the ones that were dumb enough to try it first. It's not going to be commercially viable because there's so much drag to pull one of these cages through the water, and you can't just drift all the time, or you end up in Taiwan. So you've got to tow it occasionally, and that's not commercially viable, it turns out. But this was also what was really instructive. You can see the fish around here. These are just huggies, which is the trigger fish, but there are also massive bait balls and tuna and marlin and mahi-mahi and wahoo. And so this became a great fishing site for local Kona fishermen. When it was drifting, I'd have fishermen calling me up as they're heading out of the harbor saying, "Neil, where's the fish pen? I'm heading out of the harbor." And I'm like, okay, it's about 15 miles southwest. Once we had it on the anchored 6 miles offshore, everybody knew where it was. It was on any morning, there'd be 10, 15, 20 boats around there catching fish hand over fist, which is great. I love that because then there's a synergy between, a lot of the fishing community is always skeptical of aquaculture. Here was a great quid pro quo for them. Sure. I'm happy to take questions as we go through. Don't hesitate to shout it.
Go out to international waters.
Just the logistics of that, to go 200 miles offshore. Believe me, we did think about that. Thank you very much. Yeah. But just to be able to get out, you've got to be able to be delivering feed. You've got to be able to change crew occasionally. It's just, you could do it. You could go out to the seamounts out there and more on those. But part of it is also, we firmly believe this is something that the US should embrace. And so we wanted to be sort of a test case for this, to give us the permits. 2,000 fish, it wasn't a lot of fish. It was really, it's about 1% of what a commercial fish pen would be. A commercial fish pen is 150 or 200,000 fish.
Real quick, were you using GPS to track the floating one, and then when it got too far, you go out and pull it back?
Yeah, we're not complete idiots. We actually did have a boat attached to the pen. So some of you might, some of you might know Bill Austin. You can see the Machias. Do you know Bill Austin and the Machias? Bill Austin is a phenomenal. He's like 85 years old and he's still working commercially, towing tugs down to Wake Island and back. And this was his boat, and he was out there for the full 8 months of this grow out cycle, except for 1 week when he came ashore. They forced him to come in ashore. But yeah, so we did have the vessel attached here so that we could be feeding. You got to, particularly when the fish are small, you've got to be feeding them 5 times a day. You've got to have divers in there to, some of the fish will die over the course of that. You want to remove them quickly. Actually, the mortality rate on this offshore operation was incredible. It was only like 2% of the fish over that whole 8-month grow out period. Whereas normally it would be somewhere between 15 and 25%, because there's a lot of Charlie Darwin got the natural selection, winnowing happens in a fish stock. So yeah, there was a lot to love about that. In 2017, we figured we've got to be expanding offshore aquaculture. It can't just be something that we're doing in Hawaii. So we started an operation down in the Sea of Cortez. That's La Paz, the Bay of La Paz, just there. And so this was 4 miles offshore. This was a different kind of fish pen. This is a polar circle, so that like the traditional salmon pens there, but it is still submersible. I'm going to remind you of that in a minute when we get to that. But this, we got this pen this operation up and running. Again, hatchery supplying the fingerlings using the Kampachi. And this was Aquaculture Stewardship Council certified. That was something that we had committed to our investors. We found investors that were deeply committed to doing the environmentally responsible thing. And we said to them, we will aspire to this certification. We're able to achieve that, which was the same thing that we would always want to do in any operation. So then this brings us to Ewa Beach. In 2019, we came back from Mexico. That operation's still running, but I really felt like we need to be doing more here in Hawaii. I'm going to live out the rest of my days here, and I really feel like if this is something that we are asking other people to do in Mexico, we should be doing it here as well. And when we thought about where would we want to do this, yes, we could have gone and done another farm offshore of the Big Island, but we want to be able to do it here because this is where most of the population is, most of the demand is. There's better logistics here, but also we want to make it more of a showcase. We want people to be able to see it. So we're wanting to do Nanue and moi, 3 different species of fish here: Nanue, moi, Kampachi, and then also limu. We want to be able to grow limu out there. The Nanue, as we've talked about, it's a native species. It's an herbivore. We're able to produce fingerlings. We've done this very successfully in Kona. This is about 5 times more successful than the other marine fish that we've been able to grow in the hatchery. They seem to just be adapted for domestication. And then there's really strong local demand. Everybody's had some Nanue poki at some stage, right? If you haven't, you need to get, I don't know actually where you could get some, but you need to get some. And then we'd also like to grow moi. There was previously a moi farm out there, and there was a really strong niche market. He was only about 200 tons a year, but very strong. People loved that fish. both in the restaurants and then also did very well in retail, because this is a fish that's very highly favored here. I would also like to include mahi-mahi and kampachi on the permit as well. Kampachi, because it's a phenomenal fish. I mean, that's one that we think if we do this right, that could be the warm water salmon of the world. And I say that as somebody who thinks that most salmon farming is really highly commendable, and we should be looking to replicate that. Don't believe everything you read in the papers. Most salmon farming is really responsibly done, and I think kampachi, there's a proven market for it. Has folk all eaten kampachi? If you haven't eaten kampachi, have you eaten hamachi when you get Japanese yellowtail at a sushi restaurant? It's the tropical sibling of the hamachi. So it's a sashimi grade fish. And mahi-mahi, because it's a phenomenal fish in terms of its growth. They will get up to 5-6 pounds in 6 months. I mean, it's phenomenal. And then also because of its market appeal, you can go in terms of taking this, to scale. You go into any restaurant and you say, would you like to buy mahi-mahi, farm mahi-mahi? People, yeah, absolutely. But mahi-mahi is also very challenging. We haven't figured out that. We're still at the early stage there with that. And then the limu, we've got a number of species of limu that we'd like to be growing, that we've been doing successfully in tanks, the sea grapes, the Ogo, Halamenia over on the right-hand side, your left-hand side, limu lepe ohina, that's a red seaweed that nobody has farmed before, but we've found ways to grow it, and there's some good market demand. And then the sea lettuce as well, which I'm not much of a fan of, but some chefs like to toast it and it makes crispy green stuff. The big challenge with growing limu offshore is the beautiful blue waters in Hawaii. That means that it's a desert out there, that there's no nutrients in it. It's not like California or the East Coast where it's green water full of nutrients. And so where are you going to get the nutrients from? What we're doing in Kona, because we have the Natural Energy Lab, they pump up the deep sea water, which is nutrient rich. Yeah, but okay, you can only do that in Kona. What are you going to do elsewhere? We want to think about a model that would be replicable elsewhere. And if you need nitrogen and phosphorus, that can come from, as the question earlier about the nutrients in the dissolved nutrients from the urine from the fish, or the particulates. So the idea would be that you could use the fish culture and grow the fish and the limu together. So this is the site that we're looking at. It's about the Moi operation that ran for about 14 years. Randy Cates ran that. I got out and dived on that site. That was my first introduction to offshore aquaculture. I was about 1.7 miles offshore. They were permitted for up to 10 net pens. So it's just a little bit to the west. It's off Ewa Beach, just to the west of Pearl Harbor. They went through 2 environmental assessments with the state. The first one was just for the initial permits, and then the second one in 2009 was to be able to expand. So there's already been a lot of community consultation around the Moi farm there. But they went out of business in 2013, handed the permits back to the state, and it's sat there empty ever since. We think it's a great site for offshore aquaculture. Over that 14 years that they had that operation going, there was rigorous environmental monitoring, and again, there was no significant impact because it's in fairly deep water. Our plans would be to actually move it out a little bit deeper, a little bit further offshore than where the Moi farm was. We'd like to be able to do 12 net pens out there at around, these are about twice the size of the pens that they are using in Kona. But we'd be able, they'd be like the pens that we used in Mexico, which is the traditional black plastic pipe rings, but then also submersible. And you can see here, when we want to work on the pens, we'd bring them up close to the surface. And then when it's blowing like it is out there today, or just at night for security, you can submerge them down below the surface there. This here is the preferred site that we show here. So that's about 230 feet deep and 1.7 miles offshore. We could move out further out into deeper water, one alternative that we'd like to consider, but there's no real point, we don't think, because we're plenty deep enough. And as you move out deeper water, you've got to spread your anchors further. That's just part of the way oceanography works. And then the other alternative would be a little bit further to the west, so less in front of Ewa Beach, but there it would be shallower water, and that's just, I like deeper water. I'm just more comfortable in that. So to just summarize, this is we've done this before. We understand, we've operated this sort of an operation. We've gone through the permitting process before. The location is one that's, because there was the Moi farm there previously, there's low environmental and socio-cultural impact. The local fishing community was very accepting. When Randy Cates did his second EA at 2009, there wasn't a single comment from the public on his EA, which is pretty much unheard of. We'd be growing low trophic species and ones that have local market demand, and the co-culture of the fish in the limu. The nutrient reuse is actually good for the limu, and it's also, in terms of water quality, you're cleaning up the water quality. But it's deep enough water, there'd be very low impact on the seabed. The benefits of local food production, economic diversification, and jobs. We would probably be importing the feed, but one of the things we want to figure out with the Niue is other diets. We don't necessarily want to be using the duckweed, but other kinds of seaweed. This thing makes a living eating seaweed, so we'd like to find other sorts of seaweed that we could be feeding, that we'd be growing locally. One of the things I want you all to take note of, please, even though we can't spell engagement, it needs another E, but we are, this is the act engagement, yeah. We are wanting to build partnerships with the community here. And one of the ways we would like to do that is to set up a community advisory panel. We've already had a number of folk reach out, we've reached out to, that we've invited to participate on that. If you feel moved, or if you know of folk who might be helpful in that sort of a capacity, that's going to be an ongoing, it's not just during the permit process. We want that to be ongoing. There's going to be, we're inviting ourselves into their community. We want to make sure that we do that in a way that is pono, as we say. And then also we want to be fulsome to a fault in our community outreach. We want to talk to everybody, including the Boy Scouts, if we have to, and the Girl Guides. And so that's why I'm here. You see the EcoRotary Club is listed up there already. Who else is there? I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you all later. If there's nobody, you look through this and you don't see anybody that should be up there that's not. But if I send this to you later, if you can think of any other groups that we might want to reach out to, please, because we want to, I don't want to get to the public hearing process in the EA and have somebody stand up in the back of the room and say, I've never heard about this before. So we want to be able to make sure that we are reaching out to them. So please put us in contact with them. And thank you. I'm happy to take questions for as long as you wish. I'm here all night, folks.
2 quick questions.
They don't need to be quick.
Well, they should be. One is the, go ahead.
I can do, since we're 4 minutes from 7, I can do the 4-way test and then we can do Q&A.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I will hold my 2 questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Neil. We're going to close out the meeting officially. So if people online would like to go, or if anybody here has other things to do, they may feel free, but we're going to continue the conversation as long as everyone's willing. All right. So with Rotary, we have a 4-way test. The things that we think, say, and do. 1, is it the truth? 2, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendship? 4, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And 5, will it be eco-friendly and fun?
All right, so my one question, what are the mechanics of raising and lowering the fish net?
Really good question. Yeah, from something in the airport, you're not in the Navy.
No.
You are, yeah.
It's
Close
here
enough.
though.
Okay,
Feel free to go back,
uh,
just for the recording.
it works like a submarine ballast.
Oh, okay.
That the sea stations, the ones that you saw, the True Pyramid, that central steel spar has air in it. When you blow air into it, it will raise it up, it'll displace the seawater. And then when you blow air out of it, water will, so it's steel, and so it's negatively buoyant, so it will sink. And then the polar circle style pens, they have the buoyant rim at the top and then a weighted ring underneath, and then again they have a steel cylinder submerged below there with a concrete block underneath it. So when the steel cylinder is flooded with water, it's negatively buoyant and it will pull it down. And then you've got a hose that goes from the surface down there, so you can come up and hook up that with a compressor, blow air into there, and it'll raise it back up.
Cool. And the other question is, are you working at some point, or is there consideration been given to trying to get this symbiotic relationship between the moo and the fish such that they will not have to be fed? They would just eat the seaweed and then you just put it out there and then they grow and it doesn't thing and then you
Yeah, and it's like a
will buy them.
yeah. That would be the ideal, but you do have to have some inputs in there. There's it's not like a perpetual motion machine. That you're going to have this is why we think we'd like to be growing Kampachi and Moi and the Nanue. So the idea is that the Kampachi and the Moi, they'll need a higher protein feed because they're carnivorous. But then they've got a very high nitrogen in their effluent, higher than, because it's a high protein, that waste is going to be high nitrogen then from the amino acids. And that's going to be more stimulating of the limu growth. But so then if we can identify which limu the Nanue will thrive on, then we could be using some of that limu to feed the Nanue. We think Nanue has got huge potential globally because of this model. I don't know how much you've all been tracking aquaculture development, but a lot of the NGOs, as I'd said, that they are really big fans of this restorative aquaculture. All of them love the idea of growing more seaweed and growing more bivalves. The challenge with seaweed, as I pointed out here, food and fuel. How many of you eat a lot of seaweed? When you eat it when you go to sushi restaurants, I like to eat the wakame.
Korean,
Right.
big in Korea.
Yeah. But so that's, when you're going to be growing seaweed out there, sorry, if there's an environmentally attractive option to be growing more seaweed throughout the world for all of these ecosystem benefits that it will provide, what's the economic driver that's going to be behind it? Because you can't just sell it to people. There's a lot of interest in seaweed in Alaska and in Maine, but they're growing this stuff and they don't really know what to do. There's seaweed marmalade and there's seaweed beer and there's you want to have something that's where you could be selling it. So we think that co-culture of the Nanue and limu globally, throughout the global south, particularly where you've got, this could be a really low cost production of great tasting marine fish. And then you've got an economic engine for more seaweed farms. So at the moment, people go into Indonesia or Costa Rica and they set up a seaweed farm, and then it's, where are your markets? Well, your markets are Japan, Korea, or carrageenan and agar, which needs to be processed, which is Europe or China or the US. So there's not a really strong economic driver behind this seaweed culture, but we think the Nanue could provide that. That's one of the things we'd like to try and model out here.
Cool.
Who was the jump?
Thank you. So I have two questions. So you were saying that the farms, the fish farms are not all of them are not as bad as they say they are. So the main concern is that everybody kind of is familiar with is the waste because of the feed that they use. And then the pollution that it comes to the water around it, and the ecosystems get out there and sometimes displaced from their environment. Like, how is the system that you guys use different from those like things that we normally hear about? Which ones?
Yeah, excellent question. It's deeper water, further offshore. So that's the whole, we like to call this offshore aquaculture. But even so, I think, as I said, there's a lot of salmon farming now. Like about 75% of the global salmon industry is Aquaculture Stewardship Council certified. And that's a really rigorous standard. It's very demanding, very exacting to get ASC certified. Most, 3/4 of the global salmon industry. And that's because the salmon farmers themselves have realized if you're in a crappy location with poor currents, you're going to have all sorts of disease issues that will build up, and then the ecosystem disruption. You're farming your fish in these waters. If that water starts to get rank just from poor circulation, it's going to be a problem for your fish. My co-founder in Kona Blue Water Farms, Dr. Dale Sava, he did his PhD here at UH in the 70s. And he was working in the early 80s for Middle Eastern investment group, and they were looking to invest in a salmon farm in Ireland in the early 80s. And this when they were still trying to figure out how to do this stuff. And he laughs embarrassed way because he said it was just nailed together 2x4s on these 55-gallon steel drums with nets strung in between it. People didn't really know what they were doing. They're trying to figure this stuff out. And so they're putting them in the most protected parts of these bays and estuaries. And he said when he dived underneath this salmon farm, he said he put his arm down into this gunk, this pile up of fish poo and fish feed in the bottom underneath, and he couldn't touch the bottom. He said it was disgusting. And he came up from that dive and he said, we're not investing in this. Let's go. We're done. This is going to be a nightmare. And it was for the first, decade or so. Salmon farming was done really badly because people were trying to figure it out. They were feeding them chopped up sardines, and they had these crappy engineering, poor understanding of fish health, poor understanding of fish nutrition. It has changed tremendously now to where folks such as Conservation International and Environmental Defence Fund are getting behind it now, because it's you move out into deep water, you get better control of the nutrition, really readily digestible feeds that are coming from sustainable sources, and better understanding of fish health, use of vaccines rather than back in the day. Yeah, they used to use antibiotics back in the 1980s because they didn't know any better. Well, we learned that that's really stupid. But now they're using vaccines, and there's just been phenomenal changes in the way the industry works. So you asked the question and you got a sermon.
Related to the limit or the algae.
Mhm.
So how they grow, I know that we are far away from that, but how growing algae is going to be different for ecosystems, like just having like a monocrop nowadays. Like if we just start, like what is going to determine that the algae is going to be like overly cropped to a healthy crop, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. That's a really good question, because I'm originally Australian. You scratch this entrepreneur and you get a socialist. I have strong socialist tendencies, and so yeah, that one of the concerns I have about this is as these models scale up and that it becomes a business, that the profit motive, rather than being an engine for good, when I think about it, the profit motive is a way that we can have environmentally responsible solutions to these challenges. But when you take that out to the nth degree, if it's just you end up with the cheapest operator doing things in the cheapest possible way, that's the one that's going to be most profitable, so they're going to win. So I think the answer is that through certification and consumer-driven choices, things like the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, there is a seaweed certification scheme under ASC, and so that's something that we would want to embrace. We would want this whole operation to be Aquaculture Stewardship Council certified. That's if it's not, if we're screwing it up somewhere, I'm going to be embarrassed and disappointed. And I'm sure I don't know the ASC macroalgae standards very well, so I can't cite them, but I'm sure there are measures in there for how does this work so that it's not going to become a massive monocrop and with all of the negatives that brings to it. So I think certification and consumer choice drives the seafood buyers as well. I mean, most of the commercial drivers behind the ASC is not what you or I want to eat when we go to a sushi restaurant. It is Costco and Walmart and Aldi and you know, the big supermarket chains saying, holy hell, we don't want to have people putting a banner up on top of our supermarkets about, you know, raping the seas. We want to be able to do this. Let's go and get ASC certified. So these big restaurants and retail outlets are making commitments to only serving certified product, or to saying by 2025 or by 2028 we will only serve certified product. So I think that's the driver that is going to hopefully make the idea is that the industry leaders will achieve that certification and the rest of the industry will get pulled along as well. That's the theory. Keep an eye on it and let us know how it works out. Yeah.
What was the gentleman we had in that was growing the sea asparagus and the sea tomatoes?
You know, in Wenhouse Sun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was our June speaker.
Okay. Is he still up? I tried to reach out to him and I haven't been able to.
Yeah, he's still up.
Amazing, the asparagus they were growing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How do you balance? Is the balance here to commercialize or to regrow the endangered? Because when you pull something like this out of the natural cycle, it's becoming dependent upon you, and it's not becoming replenishing. So when you showed all those charts about certain fish disappearing, this might grow a bunch of those, but it doesn't put them back into the chain.
Right.
Does it?
No. And
So is this commercial or is this saving the fish?
well, we like to think it's both, that it's commercial in that you need to have a profit driver to be able to allow things to scale. That for doing this is where the seaweed farming is a lot at the moment. It's easy to get foundation money or NGO money to go and set up a small little demonstration seaweed farm, but that doesn't have any impact on a global level. To be able to make seaweed farming work, you've got to find how do people make a living off this? How do they make profit out of this? And so we believe that you need to have commercial drivers to underpin the conservation goals. So we come at this from a deep commitment to doing this in an environmentally responsible way, but we recognize that to scale this, to have any global impact, it's got to be driven by the capitalist system. It's got to be a profit motive underneath it all. So that
But if the whole system is dependent upon the limu that you grow, then if anything happens to the limu, the entire system collapses.
Right.
Correct.
Yes, that's why the whole system would not be dependent on them. I mean, remember, we haven't yet quite figured out which limu to feed the Nanue. We can feed them. We can feed them
Regardless
limu.
of what you're feeding them, like I said, you can save wolves, but once they become domesticated, you can't stick them back out into the wild because they won't survive.
Right.
Is my point. And so if these are all dependent upon the farms, then it's not really repopulating the endangered fish that you were showing at the beginning.
Right. Yes, that's.
It would also help divert like commercial fishing, right? Like if you're farming it, you don't have to go out and take it from right, environment.
That's where
So you're not
they're
necessarily putting them back, but you're not,
You're letting them.
the ones that are in the wild.
It's about replenishing. I mean, at least this idea is not about replenishing or
Yeah, I
conservating.
don't think so.
Well,
I think it's more about like building a system that is more sustainable to
And taking
meet the
out that
needs of
option.
feeding billions and billions of people without causing extra harm. That is like what is gone is gone pretty much. That will have to be a different organization working on like preservation and restoration of species. But I think this one is just to meet
Commercial demand.
the demand in a more sustainable way. That's my outtake.
Excellent. Well, yeah, very good. You did your homework.
I would
My
say
point
so.
is, it's not what you know, it's what you don't know, like COVID.
Right.
That would cause an entire collapse of a system like this.
Mhm.
So you're concerned, you know,
You
'cause-
build up something huge like this that the entire world economy is based on, and an unknown goes in. It collapses.
Right.
Yeah,
Because
that's what-
it's not readily available worldwide, it's just under control.
Yeah, but if we're generating food, if we have to generate food anyway, you know, there are ways that are extractive, or there are ways that, you know, it's not only growing the fish, it's growing limu, which creates habitat for other species. It has the FAD, the fish aggregation ice kind of effect. So yeah, so it's creating habitat while growing food for the population, which is way better than any agriculture that we're currently doing.
So
So
pseudo related question to that unknown unknowns, have you had any issues with, say, larger fish or predators or whales going after the nets, thinking it's a bait ball?
Yes, there are, well, actually, if I may first, can I come back to, I want to, yes, you're right, but one of the things, what we want the community advisory panel to help us with, we're going to, you know, be having a hatchery where we can be producing the Nanue and the Moi. There's a limit to how many we can put in any one pen. And so there may be excess of those that we could be putting back into the ocean. The community advisory panel, we want them to advise us as to how they could see us providing benefit back to the community. We're going to commit to some percentage of our revenue that's going to go back for reef restocking work with either Nanue or Moi, or we've had a number of people come and ask for for the fish ponds to be able to produce the small mullet, the Hawaiian mullet, to go back into the fish ponds, or milkfish to go into the fish ponds. So we're open to that as just a quid pro quo. We recognize that we're asking for permission to use ocean space, which is a common property resource. And so, as well as the rental fee that we pay to DLNR, which is like, nobody's ever going to see that. We want to be able to do something that is really more tangible to the local community. And that's what we want the community advisory panel to help us think through.
Do you see any of the other countries using this to repopulate? It's like when you become a hunter, you join the NRA and the wildlife foundations and stuff so that your money goes to conserve animals and take care of the population and all of the conservation of it also. Do you see offering this to other countries as an option to repopulate their areas?
One of the
With like a tax or a fee on, you know, if you want to be a fisherman, you pay into this because we're using this to repopulate the area that you're using.
possibly, yes. The best example of that, you know, who is the biggest driving force behind protection of wetlands in the US? Duck hunters. Ducks unlimited. Yeah. And so recreational fishermen are fisher people are probably the best allies in terms of conservation of wild fish stocks. One of the other things that we're working on with another partnership, at the moment it's just in Indonesia, but we're looking at how this could scale globally. Marine protected areas everybody looks at the idea of marine protected areas as something that, God, there needs to be more of them. Preferably, they would be areas that would be very strongly protected, so sort of no take area at all. But there's a lot of these being set up in places like Indonesia and the Philippines. But how do you manage that? How do you enforce that? It requires resources. And so what we're proposing to do in Indonesia is to go in and set up a fish farm that will be in collaboration with a nearby marine protected area. So a percentage of the revenue from the farm goes to support the management and protection of the marine protected area, and other, because there's been a loss of access to that stretch of reef. So there are displaced fishermen in the community. What are some other revenue sources, or some other employment opportunities that we could generate
When I
there?
talk about protected areas, what comes to mind is we were in Africa and they decided they were going to protect all the wildlife in Africa. So they fenced off all of the reserves. And by fencing off all the reserves, they killed all the animals. They thought they were protecting them by fencing them off, and it killed them all because they couldn't migrate. And then as they ate all the grass, and as the grass died, they couldn't hide from other animals, so they got slaughtered. And now they're finding out they have to take out all these fences. And the places without fences are growing. And the places they tried to preserve, man killed.
Yeah.
So that's the red flag that goes up in my mind when you say preserve.
These are open systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just areas where there's not allowed any.
It's small right now. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, we have some marine life conservation districts in Hawaii, but they're variable in their protections. Some of them just don't allow small mesh nets or don't allow spearfishing. Yeah, I think generally marine protected, most marine ecologists would say that the best answer for marine protection is not to have a whole bunch of rules about this size, this many inches for this fish and this many inches, but just have some areas of reef that are totally protected and use those as where you'll have spillover effects and a good viable breeding population in those areas. So we'd like to see more. I'd love to see more of those here in Hawaii. But in places like Indonesia, where the communities and the environmentalists are working together to set these up, how do they get ongoing financial support for that? And that's where the idea of a farm could actually provide revenue for that. But there's a multitude of ways that we think that there can be this mutual back scratch between responsible aquaculture and marine conservation. So maybe we're not directly restocking the fish out there, but we're providing avenues or some sort of support. And we want to let
you said the ducks.
Right.
If the government's to buy in,
Right.
make it mandatory.
Right. So to your question, you'd asked about large animal predators. Yeah. The Kona operation, there are a lot of sandbar and black tip sharks around there. Usually they're down deep. But there's new management on that farm just the last couple of years. And so I've back before, once we'd sold it, they didn't want me out on their farm because they thought that I was going to be looking for competition. Okay, we started the farm in Mexico, we're competing. But now we've got a much more congenial relationship with them. And I've been out there a couple of times in the last few years. And there are sharks there. It's the ocean. It's an oasis. It's a giant fish aggregating device. But the sharks aren't necessarily not aggressive. In what I saw, there are monk seals and dolphins around the operation. Bottlenose dolphins. There was one in the time that we were running the operation. There was one bottlenose dolphin that he had a hook and a bunch of leader in his jaw, and he showed up at the farm site and he just stayed and stayed and stayed. Other dolphins had come through before and stayed for a while and then moved on. This guy stayed there for months. When he came in, he was really skinny. And the biologist said, this guy's really struggling because he had this hook and this leader that he was dragging, but he could, the akule and the apelu that were in around the pens, he could get those because they were hanging around the pens a lot more. So he started to put on weight. They came down a couple of times, a whole bunch of boats and a whole bunch of federal marine mammal experts trying to catch this dolphin. It was hilarious. The dolphin thought this was a game. So one of our guys that was diving was at one stage he was stitching one of the nets up where there'd been a hole in one of the nets, and the dolphin had come up behind him and had let it, and the guy reached around, made sure that no federal agency was looking, and cut the leader on the dolphin. The dolphin came back around again, and because he cut it down with it and cut it even shorter. And then the dolphin started to put on weight, and after another several months, he took off. And one presumes that the hook fell out. So there are still dolphins that show up and hang around. There's a couple of monk seals that will come around from time to time. There was one for a while that I understood was problematic in that it was hanging around there so much that it was sucking some of the dead Kampachi out of the bottom of the pens. It sucked the guts out of the Kampachi. They got a really powerful.
Wow.
And so the marine mammal experts in NOAA were saying, this is not healthy. This animal is way overweight. It's a monk seal. Yeah, there's a lot of monk seals overweight. But that animal's come and gone. So it's like an oasis. And so here as well, there will be bait fish. There will be marine mammals and sharks. I don't know if we're going to see, it's probably not deep enough to see the number of tuna and mahi-mahi and wahoo that we saw around the drifter pen, because that was in open ocean. But
has anything put a hole in it, or
I should have brought the show and tell. No, not at all. But the netting, I was talking about the dramatic advances in aquaculture. In the last 15 years, there have been 2 new types of netting that have come onto the market that have been absolute game changers. Instead of nylon netting that shark teeth just saw their way through, or that other animals, dolphins or seals can rip when they get at it, there is now a single filament polyethylene terephthalate. It's the same sort of plastic that the indestructible drink bottles.
They use it for guns.
I don't know guns very well, clearly, but
you can't break it.
Right, yeah. And that's a black, it's called Kiko net. There's one company in Japan that makes it, and it's phenomenally strong. I first found it where there was an Australian barramundi farmer farming inside the Great Barrier Reef in crocodile country, mate. And the bloody crocs can't get through this. It's the thing that saved me bloody farm. Was the story I got from this guy down the phone.
Wow.
And it keeps crocodiles out. And I've had people break scissors when they're trying to cut through this stuff. So it's phenomenally strong. And then the other thing, we may use that, but there's also for the Kampachi, particularly the biofouling, if you get a lot of limu growing on the netting, that leads to fish health issues because parasite eggs get attached to the limu. So what they're doing in Kona, and has proven really good and what we were doing in Mexico, is a copper alloy mesh. So essentially it's like a brass netting, and you get no fouling on that at all, and it's just like chain link fence. So these have been real game changers in terms of keeping it's really important in aquaculture to keep the sharks on one side and the fish on the other. If you get them mixed up or you get them the other way around, it just doesn't work very well. So yeah, that's.
What kind of problems do you have? Patenting, trademarking, service marking, do you have any other competition from governments? Any other governments?
Not
or eyeballing what you're doing?
Not governments, no. And aquaculture, generally people are kind of happy to share. Everybody wants to see the rising tide to lift all boats, because we all feel a little bit target-rich opportunity, the opportunity to grow this industry it is what they call it a pre-competitive environment. It's a competition between the fish farmers isn't so great as let's just get more fish and get more efficient at this. No, it's I've got to be careful how I say this because some of my cousins and uncles back in Australia are cattle ranchers, but the competition is beef. We want people to be eating more seafood and less beef because it's better for them.
Eat more chicken or eat more.
The cows say eat more chicken.
Okay.
Sorry, I lost my thread.
I'm so sorry.
Competition.
Right. Competition between so
Anytime you start making a profit,
well,
eyebrows are going to be raised.
yeah, there is a percentage of revenue that goes to the state government through DLNR. That will be able. We'll need to get a lease from the state government, so it's got to go through the whole DLNR process. And I believe it's 1% of the revenue that goes to the state DLNR, and we're using state property, so paying that rental fee is not something that we're going to kick and complain about. The pre-competitive collaboration, there's a really good example here on the Global Salmon Initiative. This is salmon farmers. Still, even the salmon farming now is like nearly 3 million tons a year. And you'd think, oh, it's really going to be really competitive between them. They look around at the landscape and they say, no, we just need to be helping each other do this better. And so that's how they got to that 75% certified Aquaculture Stewardship Council, as they started this Global Salmon Initiative, where they all got together and just started sharing information. Okay, yeah, they kept a couple of secrets here and there.
They looked at all of the hunters did it backwards.
Well, things like sharing information about which feed stuff, the more sustainable feed stuff, like the feeding tofu instead of fish meal, and feeding microalgae oils instead of fish oil, stuff like that. They shared that stuff between the big salmon farming companies, and that helped them really rapidly advance. So that's more the environment that we see. We don't feel competitive at all. But we do feel a little bit competitive. Yes, yeah, right. That's one of the things that capitalism does. It pushes people towards. Eventually, you got to become competitive.
Yeah, so I've seen you wrote about this, or it was written in the seasetting book about the concept of winnowing and choosing what species to, like how we winnowed out the right species to farm for land agriculture. We never did that with aquaculture. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. That's it was actually based on his name, New York journalist that wrote For Fish. He talked about this. Why am I spacing? Paul Greenberg. Thank you. Yeah. He had Paul Greenberg in his book For Fish, which I highly recommend, had talked about how do we figure out which of the fish we should be farming. Aquaculture is famous for there's this multitude of different species that are farmed all over the world. And it really is just a process of identifying which ones you can produce in the hatchery and which ones you can get on sustainable feeds and you can grow without too much harangue. And then what is their market demand for? And so this is where we were the first folk to do the Kampachi from hatchery. Kampachi had been farmed in Japan as sort of a small little segment of the hamachi industry, but we looked at that fish and like we could produce, the brood stock would spawn 2 or 3 times a week, which gives you this ready supply of eggs. They did reasonably well in the hatchery. It was challenging, but you could produce them. Really good feed conversion ratios. How many pounds of feed do you need to put in to get a pound of sashimi out the other side, or a pound of whole fish, actually, not just a sashimi? So for most fish, it's pretty good to get around 2 or 3 pounds of feed to get a pound of fish, because the feed is relatively inexpensive and the fish hopefully. But for the Kampachi, it was up to a 1 kilo fish. It's less than 1 to 1. That fish is phenomenal at just, because it's just got a really efficient metabolism. It grows really quickly. They'll get to 4 or 5 pounds in a year. And it's this sashimi grade fish. So that was all of those different criteria go into identifying which species were going to be suitable. That's why we love the Kampachi. It's where I think the Nanue has got great potential as well, because it's, you can feed it tilapia diet or a seaweed diet, and really easy to do in the hatchery. We haven't yet figured out how to make them spawn. We've got fish in a tank and they just spawn occasionally, but we don't see any pattern in that, which is really strange, mysterious. But they've also got, great market appeal. We think a lot of folk, particularly folk on the mainland, down in the Gulf of Mexico, where they catch these fish, they call them chubs. People will say, oh, we just throw those fish back. It tastes like seaweed. Well, that's a lot of people like that flavor. Or if you put them on the tilapia diet, they actually don't taste like seaweed at all. They've got more like a snapper flavor in there. So we think that the Nanue has got a lot of potential to grow globally as well. So yeah, that winnowing process of those criteria that we use to select them.
And tuna is like 1 pound or 10 pounds of feed to grow 1 pound of tuna.
Yeah,
right.
We always get people saying that, oh, don't you want to farm tuna? I'm like, well, no. Not really. No, maybe yellowfin, because that's a lot of the yellowfin tuna is a tropical species that doesn't regulate its body temperature. A lot of the cold water tuna, bluefin tuna, it runs like a furnace to keep its metabolism up. So it uses a lot of the feed in a lot of the energy in its feed just to keep its body temperature up. And so that means that it's got this 10 to 1 feed conversion ratio or so in around that, which just makes no sense. Even if you're getting paid $30 a kilo for the fish, it's just, from an ecological perspective, it makes no sense.
April has a question.
Hi, April.
Hey there. So I noticed on your retail packaging that it was being sold at KTA. Are you selling any of the limu or fish that you guys are generating over in Kona in local markets on Big Island?
On Big Island, yes, we had been selling it in KTA. That's also where we sold the Nanue initially. Sorry, did I get your question right? Because
no, I saw that you were selling it at KTA. Just wondering if you were working with any like local farmers market to kind of infiltrate that, not just the regular grocery store shoppers, because it's a local product and you're doing local environmental work. It would seem like such a good fit, maybe even for like adaptations or something like that.
Really good question. Yes, the adaptations folk, we've spoken to them. Sorry, that's Maureen Dada. I've known Maureen for years, and we'd reached out to them and just about doing some of the limu sales, and they thought that it wouldn't work at the price point that we're at the moment.
Do you know if those products, I would assume, but just do you know if they qualify for SNAP or Double Up Food Bucks benefits?
I don't. I'm sorry, I don't know what you've got to do to get qualified for those. But I think generally where we end up at a higher price point than what at this stage, because it's a question of scale. Part of what we want to be able to do here, why we chose to be here on Oahu, is that because there's a larger market, we can get to scale more efficiently, and so that gets your price down, and so your price per kilo for both the fish and the limu would be lower if we're a larger operation because you've got a lot of fixed costs in there. And so
Truly, if it's considered a fresh fruit or vegetable, I believe the program's been pushed through until the end of June. It would seem to me that it would be considered a 50% off with the double up food bucks eligible item. And KTA is one of the very few places on Big Island that accepts that, but that would make the price point a lot more affordable for folks because they would only be paying half. So the price point doesn't always matter to those folks because they're only paying half of that price, which makes it a lot more approachable, allows you guys to scale and so on. Love to talk to you more about it afterwards. I do have to get back to work. I'm actually prepping for the farmer's market, but I thought of something when Doug had mentioned the fences that kept animals in Africa from roaming in the land. And it reminded me of when we went to Denali and you know, basically I said it takes a lot more than laws and boundaries to protect a park. It takes science and understanding. And then it went so far as to say that Denali's borders only exist on maps. And that was really, you know, it triggered me. And that there are no fences at the park's boundaries or its borders or boundaries in Denali. The only, you know, it doesn't keep wildlife in, and it doesn't keep change out.
That's
Two ways of thinking of that.
yeah. I might, April, are you on the Big Island or are you here on Oahu?
I'm on Big Island.
Okay. I'd like to follow up with you then about how this limu might work in farmers markets or
Absolutely.
SNAP program. So do you have my email address? You can get it through Jake.
Yeah, I'll share it.
It's up on the screen right now, it looks
Right,
like,
there
or
you go.
is that the correct one? The
That's the correct one.
Gencia? Okay, beautiful.
No, that's Neil. I'm Neil. Jenica is.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. No, but please do reach back out. I'd love to hear more about how we can make that work.
Me as well. I'd love to. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time and good night, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
April.
April.
Aloha. Hey,
Thank you.
Yeah.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Wonderful. Wow.
no, I really appreciate your questions.
Yeah,
That was a
brilliant.
good bunch of questions.
Oops.